Imagine, if you will, the dark, freezing waters of the Black Sea just before dawn. The date is February 24th, 2022. For weeks, the world had been holding its breath, a tension so thick you could feel it across continents. But in that moment, in the eerie pre-dawn silence, all hesitation ended. This was not a skirmish. It was the onset of a massive, coordinated attack, a full-spectrum assault designed to decapitate a nation within 24 hours. Russia's meticulously planned operation was, on paper, an overwhelming display of military power. At the center of this storm was the Black Sea. We, the enthusiasts of naval history and military might, understand the strategic calculus involved. Control of the sea lanes means control of a nation's economic and logistical lifeline. The naval component of this assault was massive, involving a deployment of the Black Sea Fleet unprecedented since the Cold War. Our intelligence suggested a rapid strike force. 12 major warships were positioned for a multi-pronged attack. Their objectives were clear: amphibious landings near Odessa, crippling naval bases on the coast, and enforcing a maritime blockade that would choke the Ukrainian economy. This massive fleet, a true steel monster of the sea, positioned itself like a predator ready to pounce. Concurrently, on land, the sheer scale of the ground invasion was staggering. Reports were quickly escalating to confirm the deployment of nearly 9,000 elite soldiers and mechanized units across key border crossings. These weren't just border patrols. These were the spearhead of a blitzkrieg, armed with the assumption of swift, overwhelming victory. Their mission, a rapid drive towards the capital, Kyiv, to seize key infrastructure and government centers. This was a ground force of immense size, backed by a belief in their own invincibility. But the true architect of terror in those initial hours was the air campaign. In the first 24 hours alone, intelligence tracked at least 40 confirmed airstrikes, utilizing high-precision guided missiles and long-range bomber sorties. These weren't random attacks. They were surgically aimed at command and control centers, air defense systems, and airfields across Ukraine. The goal was to blind and cripple Ukraine's ability to coordinate a defense before they even knew what hit them. The sound of these massive strikes, the roaring of jets, became the new, terrifying soundtrack of the war. We, as observers, must understand the psychology behind such an overwhelming show of force. It was designed not just to defeat, but to demoralize. It was meant to make Ukraine believe that resistance was futile, that they were facing an unstoppable tide. This entire operation was a single, monstrous wave. 9,000 soldiers pouring over the land, 12 warships commanding the seas, and 40 airstrikes tearing through the sky. A complete, 24-hour military blitz that, by all conventional military logic, should have broken the back of Ukraine's defense. Yet, here is where the story pivots. Here is where the military textbooks are thrown out the window. This calculated thunderbolt, designed for a swift victory, was about to meet a resistance that changed the course of modern warfare. This is the detail, the moment of defiance, that even Hollywood often overlooks. Because despite this massive, coordinated onslaught, what happened next was not the capitulation everyone expected. The true battle, the one involving a few brave souls, a handful of ingenious weapons, and a secret no one saw coming, was just beginning. The fate of Ukraine, and perhaps the world, hung in the balance, and it rested not on the size of the attacking force, but on the unyielding will of those who fought back. Then, this happened. The first major front was, let's zoom in on the naval theater, the Black Sea. The initial Russian objective was the rapid seizure of Snake Island, Zmyiy Island, and the establishment of dominance over the coastal areas. The 12 warships, armed to the teeth, were the tip of this spear. The sheer firepower they represented was a direct and undeniable threat to any remaining Ukrainian naval assets and coastal infrastructure. The expectation was simple: a total and immediate maritime defeat. The second front, focusing on the ground invasion, spearheaded by those 9,000 elite soldiers, faced immediate and unexpected friction. Military analysts believed that the speed and mass of the columns would prevent Ukraine from effectively mobilizing. However, the response was decentralized, fierce, and remarkably adaptive. Small, highly mobile Ukrainian units, armed with Western-supplied anti-tank weapons like the Javelin and NLAW, became the nightmare of Russian armored convoys. The strategic importance of these shoulder-fired missiles cannot be overstated. They acted as a digital shield against the seemingly unstoppable mechanized assault, turning thousands of feet of steel into burning wrecks. The Russian advance, despite its initial momentum and overwhelming numbers, began to slow down, caught in the quicksand of local, determined resistance. The third crucial component was the Ukrainian Air Force. The primary target of the initial 40 airstrikes managed to survive. The ability of the Ukrainian air defense system and their pilots to adapt, reposition, and retaliate was the first major military surprise of the war. They used a network of decentralized command posts and an element of surprise that frustrated the Russian goal of achieving air superiority. The initial wave of strikes failed to completely eradicate the Ukrainian air defense network, allowing a continued, albeit limited, capability to contest the skies. This failure to secure the airspace directly hampered the ground troops and protected the command structure from collapsing. The fourth crucial component was that this happened moment began to crystallize through a series of tactical defeats for the massive Russian forces. The sheer logistical demand of supplying 9,000 soldiers for a 24-hour blitz proved to be a catastrophic overestimation. Supply lines, already strained, were targeted and severed by Ukrainian special forces and drone operators. The vast scale of the operation, its reliance on speed over sustained logistics, became its Achilles heel. It was a failure of planning, a detail that surprised nearly every major military power watching the conflict. The 9,000 soldiers, meant to be the conquering heroes, quickly found themselves bogged down, running low on fuel and food. The fifth major front was the role of naval anti-ship missiles emerged as a game-changer. The Ukrainian Navy, significantly smaller and less equipped, refused to be sidelined by the presence of 12 major warships. They utilized both indigenous weapons and eventually Western systems to challenge the Russian maritime dominance. The subsequent sinking of major Russian vessels demonstrated a vulnerability that shocked the world. A smaller, less powerful naval force could successfully challenge a global military power using asymmetric warfare. This was the true counter-narrative to the initial, seemingly overwhelming naval assault. The once invincible fleet was forced to retreat, ceding ground and strategic positioning, marking a pivotal moment in the conflict that was not part of Russia's 24-hour victory plan. The unforeseen resilience, fueled by effective tactical defense and a moral conviction, had turned a planned blitzkrieg into a protracted struggle. The story had changed dramatically, and the narrative of a swift, dominant victory was irrevocably shattered. We now move past the initial shock and analyze the deeper, more profound adaptation that emerged from the ashes of that first 24-hour assault. The sheer military might displayed, the 9,000 soldiers, the 12 warships, the 40 airstrikes, was designed to operate within a specific strategic model: decapitation and rapid conquest. But Ukraine proved to be a fluid, decentralized adversary, forcing a critical breakdown of that model. The first major front was the most important factor in the success of the defense, was not a new piece of hardware, but a fundamental shift in doctrine, the weaponization of information and small unit mobility. Instead of confronting the massive Russian columns head-on, Ukrainian forces utilized their knowledge of the terrain and civilian infrastructure to their advantage. They turned the enemy's strength, its mass and visibility, into its greatest weakness. Imagine the logistical nightmare: a column designed to move quickly, now forced to crawl through dense urban and forested areas, vulnerable to ambushes by small teams of highly motivated, locally sourced defenders. The second front, focusing on examining the fascinating narrative of the Black Sea Fleet's defeat. The 12 warships represented a traditional power projection, large, intimidating, and difficult to sink. However, their reliance on close-in operations and their exposure within a relatively confined body of water proved to be a fatal flaw. The introduction of anti-ship missile technology, specifically the domestically produced Neptune cruise missile, changed the entire calculus. This was the true David versus Goliath story. A smaller nation's ingenuity, a detail that was rarely discussed in the pre-war analysis, was enough to force the withdrawal and repositioning of a major naval power. The mere threat of these missiles became a strategic deterrent, effectively countering the enormous numerical superiority. The third crucial component was the air defense response was a masterclass in asymmetrical warfare. After the initial wave of 40 airstrikes aimed at crippling their air force, Ukraine immediately pivoted to a mobile, highly survivable air defense structure. They utilized a combination of Soviet-era systems and modern Western-supplied shoulder-fired missile launchers known as MANPADS. These small, portable systems were everywhere, turning the low-flying Russian attack helicopters and jets into easy targets. The Russian forces, expecting a clear, uncontested airspace after their initial blitz, found themselves fighting a ghost war against a constantly moving, decentralized network. This meant that the airborne support for those 9,000 soldiers was severely limited, exacerbating their already crippling logistical issues. The fourth crucial component was the human element. The story of the 9,000 soldiers versus the civilian population became a strategic failure of the highest order. The Russian military command had made a catastrophic assumption that their forces would be welcomed, or at least met with passive resistance. Instead, they were met with organized, unified civilian opposition. This popular resistance further eroded the morale of the invading forces, who were often ill-prepared for the brutal reality of urban warfare and counterinsurgency tactics. It was the unseen factor in the military equation, the power of collective will, that turned the tide of battle. The fifth major front was perhaps most revealing, was the logistical collapse that plagued the attacking forces. A 24-hour operation demands flawless, almost scientific supply lines. But with columns stalled by defensive actions and fuel depots destroyed by Ukrainian artillery, the blitz turned into a crawl. The sight of sophisticated Russian tanks and armored vehicles abandoned on the roadside, simply because they ran out of gas, became a powerful global image. It was a clear demonstration that even the largest military force is rendered utterly useless without the fundamental resources to sustain itself. The initial display of might, 9,000 men and 12 warships, was undone not just by bullets and missiles, but by the lack of fuel and food. The world watched, and the expected victory turned into an impossible quagmire. This strategic failure, rooted in arrogance and underestimation, is the true meaning of the "then this happened" moment. The failure of Russia's 24-hour, overwhelming assault sent shockwaves through the global military and political establishment. What followed was a swift, profound re-evaluation of military power and the role of modern defense alliances, particularly NATO. The first major front was the initial success of Ukrainian small unit tactics forced a rethinking of NATO's eastern flank defense doctrine. The image of 9,000 soldiers halted by a relatively small but highly motivated, decentralized defense unit proved that mass and brute force could be countered by agility and precision. This led to an immediate surge in the demand for asymmetrical warfare training and the procurement of light, highly mobile anti-tank and anti-air systems, the very weapons that had proven so effective in the hands of the Ukrainian forces. Nations previously hesitant about modernizing their defense now committed billions to these highly portable, effective countermeasures. The second front, focusing on the performance of the Black Sea Fleet, exposed vulnerabilities in traditional naval power projection. The fact that the 12 warships and their supporting vessels were constantly under threat from coastal anti-ship batteries, even relatively old or domestic ones, demonstrated a critical need for NATO to enhance its coastal defense capabilities, particularly in the Baltic and Mediterranean seas. This directly drove the increased commitment of resources to sophisticated electronic warfare and long-range targeting systems capable of neutralizing naval threats from a distance. The traditional dominance of the large surface combatant was, for the first time in decades, seriously questioned. The third crucial component was the economic and military supply response from the West became the backbone of the continued resistance. The failure of the 40 airstrikes to dismantle Ukraine's command structure meant that the country remained capable of effectively receiving and integrating massive amounts of foreign aid. This flow of weaponry, from long-range artillery to advanced air defense, directly challenged the Russian invasion. We saw an unprecedented activation of the Lend-Lease program, echoing the massive logistical effort of World War II. The material support was not merely humanitarian, it was a military strategy to bleed the aggressor and give the defender the necessary tools to sustain a protracted war. The fourth crucial component was the war confirmed the emerging dominance of unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, or drones, in modern combat. The use of commercial, off-the-shelf drones, converted for reconnaissance and light strike missions, proved to be an invaluable asset in countering the large-scale mechanized columns. These small, low-cost assets provided an immediate real-time intelligence advantage that allowed the Ukrainian defenders to target the immobilized and vulnerable Russian supply columns. This technology proved to be the ultimate counter to the traditional military doctrines, offering a terrifying degree of precision and deniability. It fundamentally changed how ground forces, including those of NATO, view intelligence gathering and battlefield targeting. The fifth major front was the greatest impact was on the collective security apparatus of Europe. The assault, intended to divide and intimidate the West, achieved the exact opposite. It directly led to the historic decisions by previously non-aligned nations, such as Finland and Sweden, to apply for NATO membership. This single geopolitical shift, a direct consequence of the 24-hour attack, fundamentally altered the balance of power in Northern Europe and strengthened the alliance's resolve. The geopolitical map of Europe was redrawn by the unforeseen courage and determination of the Ukrainian people, turning a localized invasion into a global watershed moment. The sheer resilience of the human spirit, armed with the right technology and unwavering external support, proved that the age of unchallenged military dominance by large powers is drawing to a close. The story of the first 24 hours evolved from an assault into a lesson in modern defense. The historical legacy of that critical period, beginning with the massed assault of February 24, 2022, transcends the immediate conflict. It has provided the world with invaluable lessons on naval power, technological adaptation, and the unwavering force of national will. The first major front was the strategic blunder involving the 12 warships has forever changed naval doctrine, not just in the Black Sea, but globally. The focus has decisively shifted toward integrated coastal defense systems and the utilization of high-tech, long-range anti-ship missiles. Naval powers are now investing heavily in electronic warfare and countermeasures to protect their surface fleet from the kind of asymmetric attacks that proved so devastating. The notion of sea denial, where a smaller force prevents a larger force from operating freely in coastal waters, has become the new paradigm, proving that the cost of a battleship can be nullified by a single, clever missile. The second front, focusing on the enduring story of the 9,000 soldiers who failed to achieve their primary objectives, highlights the critical nature of logistics and morale. No amount of initial firepower can compensate for a broken supply chain or a demoralized fighting force. This has pushed modern armies to invest in more agile, dispersed logistical systems and to prioritize the psychological readiness and motivation of their soldiers. The world has learned that the best defense is not always the largest army, but the most motivated and best supplied one. This is a profound lesson for any aspiring military power. The third crucial component was the swift, adaptive response to the 40 airstrikes, demonstrates the importance of systemic defense resilience. The inability to take down the Ukrainian air defenses forced a re-evaluation of how air campaigns are conducted. Future conflicts will see a greater reliance on stealth, electronic countermeasures, and saturation attacks, as the cost of losing manned aircraft to portable air defense systems has become too high. Furthermore, the conflict underscored the need for NATO to invest in a layered missile defense system that can counter not just ballistic missiles, but also the relentless, low-cost threat of cruise missiles and swarming drones. The fourth crucial component was the widespread use of commercial-grade technology in the conflict has democratized warfare. The immediate and effective deployment of drones, encrypted satellite communications, and open-source intelligence, OSINT, demonstrated that technology once reserved for military superpowers is now accessible and rapidly deployable by smaller forces. This technological decentralization is the true game-changer, leveling the playing field against conventional military advantages. The agility of smaller nations to integrate and utilize these fast-moving technologies has exposed the slow, bureaucratic procurement cycles of many established military forces. Finally, the consequences of this initial clash meant the most powerful legacy of all is the geopolitical shift that has taken place. The 24-hour assault's failure did not just protect Ukraine, it cemented a united Western front and brought formerly neutral powers under the NATO umbrella. This is the enduring truth of the conflict. A calculated military gamble backfired spectacularly, leading to a much stronger, more cohesive military alliance dedicated to collective defense. The war is now seen not just as a conflict between two nations, but as a watershed moment in the history of modern naval and land warfare, offering lessons that military strategists will study for decades to come. The initial assault was a tragedy, but the defense became a universal lesson in survival and technological adaptation.